Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Garais, BIO116, Anatomy and Physiology 2. And this is a quick overview of Chapter 16. So we're now going to talk about the lymphatic system. We mentioned before in the Anatomy and Physiology 1 that wherever there's an artery in the vein, there's a nerve. Well, another thing that is also true is wherever there's an artery in a vein, there's also a lymphatic vessel. Now, what is the function of your lymphatic vessels? Its primary function is to circulate lymph fluid, which is part of your immune system. But another thing that it also does is it works closely with the cardiovascular system to, and this right here is the immune part, it it removes excess interstitial fluid or excess fluid from your cardiovascular system so as to prevent edema. And edema is when the interstitial fluid gets out of hand and it starts flooding areas that shouldn't be flooded with fluid. And like we mentioned before, too much of a good thing, like water, becomes a bad thing. Another thing that the lymphatic system does is removes lipids, and especially in your gastrointestinal system, and they remove it through very specific lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. So think lacteals, lipids. So those are the three functions of your lymphatic system. Now, your lymphatic system here, let me see, minimize this one screen. Okay, your lymphatic system, trying to minimize the screen, is colored in green. Of course, just like the conventions of red, yellow, and blue, your lymphatic system sees. Your lymphatic system is colored green. These are your lymph nodes, and these are your lymphatic capillaries. And you could see they're closely associated, especially with the venous or the pulmonary circulation side of things, because of the capillary system of your lymphatic system um, mirrors the low pressure. It also has valves as well. It mirrors um, your venous blood vessels. Right now, the fluid inside is called lymph, and it is it's just like plasma, but it doesn't have the plasma proteins in it. And you can see how it's closely associated with lymphatic vessels and mostly with the venous system. They, of course, just like your arteries and veins, have layers, and just like your arteries and veins, the middle layer is consisting of smooth muscle, right? And the outer layer, of course, tough connective tissue, and the inner layer, a little bit more delicate endothelial lining. And like I mentioned earlier, they also have valves so as to prevent backflow, because lymphatic vessels are low pressure, just like veins. Now, what are your lymphatic trunks and your lymphatic collecting ducts? All this extra adipose material, adipose fluid, and interstitial fluid has to go somewhere. So it goes to these things. And if you look at this picture here, let's see if this can be increased to view. No, it cannot. I guess you got to lean in a little bit. You could see that you have your thoracic duct and intercostal trunk. They're all here and here in closer to your abdominal cavity. And they drain out all that extra fluid. So you have lymphatic capillaries, goes through lymph nodes, and it'll end up in your lymphatic trunk and collecting duct. and then empties back into your subclavian vein and goes in through your um, cardiovascular system. So lymph fluid, it's just like blood plasma, but it doesn't have the plasma proteins, but it has everything else. Again, the prevention of edema. Edema is when you have too much interstitial fluid, and that's the fluid that's in between cells. Also called third space sequestration. You might hear that in your future career. And again, the lymphatic fluid and the lymphatic vessels, their function is to filter um, excess adipose tissue and excess interstitial fluid, because if it gets out of hand, you will have the accumulation of excess tissue fluid, and that's called edema, and that's bad news for, it's multisystemic effects. It's bad news for everybody. Just like the veins, contraction of skeletal muscles, your respiratory muscles, and also some the smooth muscles that are located in the middle layer of your lymphatic vessels, all influence the movement of your lymph fluid. Because again, your lymph fluid, your lymph vessels are under low pressure. So we need these three things to help us move stuff. And of course, again, mentioned already 2 times, valves are also located in your lymphatic vessels to prevent backflow. Nice to know. It's saying the same thing. So where are some of the concentrations, as you saw in that picture of that woman with all the green blood vessels? Well, you have MALT, or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. And of course, where is it going to be associated with? Anywhere there's mucosa. And there is tons of mucosa in your digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Tonsils and appendix are also part of your immune system, and also associated with MALT. One of the big examples of MALT are your Peyer's patches. These are these lymphatic nodules or lymph nodes that are found in your ileum, which is the tail end part of your small intestine. So think Peyer's patches, small intestine, specifically your ileum. Okay. Other places that your lymphatic tissues are connected to, of course, is lymph nodes. We're going to talk about them in a minute. Thymus, we already know that is associated with your T cells and B cells. And your spleen is also associated with the conservation and kind of the recycling of all your blood cells, your red blood cells in specific, but it also does your white blood cells as well. So what are lymph nodes? So lymph nodes, they are kind of like way stations. In the military, they call them forward operating bases. So like you have your cervical region, axillary region, you have certain regions where you have a bunch of lymph nodes. So let's say, for example, I got a toothache or an infection in my gum line. It's going to affect my cervical region. So instead of trying to pool lymph fluid and white blood cells from far away distal places, well, we can get them from these forward operating bases called lymph nodes. And the lymph nodes contain your entire complement of white blood cells, everything that's in your white blood cell differential. And the main thing they have is thugs, macrophages, of course, derivatives of monocytes. Those are agranulocytes. But remember, the lymph nodes has everything in it, and there's different regions, different forward operating bases. Now, the one place that your lymph node is not found is in your central nervous system, and you should know why, because your brain and your spinal cord are essentially sterile. They should not, in a normal situation, have any foreign body, bacteria, virus, and whatnot. Okay? So everywhere in your body except the central nervous system. And here's an example of a lymph node, and what do you have inside them? All of the above. You have neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, monocytes, lymphocytes, B cells, T cells, antibodies. You have everything. It's kind of like, an all-in-one immune fighting system. And they're located in regions all around your body. So you have, of course, thoracic here, cervical up here, inguinal here, right? Pelvic here, okay? And they're all over because wherever there's an artery, vein, and nerve, there has to be lymphatic tissue. Um, what else? What else do lymph nodes do other than provide immune surveillance by having an entire complement of white blood cells at their disposal, especially the macrophages and lymphocytes? They also filter out harmful things that are in the lymph. Okay. They can also produce lymphocytes. Okay. And remember, our lymphocytes are B cells and T cells. They will attack various pathogens, and the lymph nodes are close and nearby, just like our forward operating base analogy. And of course, no unit would be complete without your thugs, without your warriors, which are the macrophages. Thymus, we already talked about, B and T cells. There is located in your thoracic region, and they're more active when you're younger. But by the time you get to puberty, it's not as active. But it's active when you definitely most need it when you are a child. Okay. And here's your thymus. Do not get it confused with your thyroid or your parathyroid, which is up here. Your thymus is in your thoracic region here. Spleen. We mentioned before the spleen is reticular tissue. It filters out red blood cells when they get old, and that's in your red pulp. But they also have white pulp, which also does what? Recycle and create a bunch of lymphocytes. Okay. But remember what the red pulp does, especially with red blood cells who are 120 days out. They recycle them and break them down just like your liver would. Spleen is located in your left upper quadrant, a little bit behind your stomach area, and it's here. Body defenses, a little bit of immunology here. So, of course, immunity is your body to prevent the 249 things or pathogens that can potentially give you disease. Pathogen means gen, creation of, patho is disease. So even dust can get you sick. Water can get you sick. Anything can get you sick. It's a potential. So you have innate and adaptive defenses. Your innate are anything that's general, right? Or the things that you were born with, like your skin and your inflammatory response. Those are things that an infant has. Therefore, they're innate, they're nonspecific. The adaptive specific defenses come a little bit later, and those are your what? Memory cells, B cells, and T cells, lymphocytes. They're specific, they're precise, and they're much faster and than innate nonspecific defenses. Um, Resistance, nice to know. Mechanical barriers. Well, let's talk about mechanical barriers because that's a part of your innate immune defenses, right? And considered your first line. So that's your skin and your mucous membranes. Those are called mechanical barriers because they physically keep things out, right? They're considered a first line of defense. Anything after that is second and third line defense. Okay, so first line defense, I want you to think skin, mucous membranes. All other non-specific defenses, like generalized inflammation, is part of your second line of defense. So inflammation, second line of defense. know your 5 cardinal signs and symptoms of inflammation: redness, swelling, heat, and pain, and of course, functionalisia, loss of function. And we know why it's red. There's blood coming in, vasodilation, right? We want, it goes, remember, the mast cells and basophils secrete heparin to thin out your blood. So, and with this vasodilation, it brings all the white blood cells to the place of either infection or damage. And of course, swelling, we want to sequester that. Heat, because blood is warm, and pain, the nociceptors are there to tell us where exactly the problem is so we can go deal with it. Okay. Nociceptors, pain receptors. Exudate fluids, remember it could have some damage. So of course, fibrinogen and clotting factors, vitamin K as well, come into play. Because if you have an infection in an area, there could be what? Damage from that infection. Know these innate defense chemical barriers. These are non-specific second-line defenses. Remember, first-line defense is your skin and mucous membranes. These are considered second-line defense as long as with your inflammation. So know these terms. Know what enzymes are: interferons, defensins, collectins, and complement. And complement and defensins and collectins, these and interferons as well. These are part of the immunoglobulins that we talked about in earlier this week's lecture regarding plasma proteins. These will all be in your plasma proteins. This also has to do with chemotaxis. How does the white blood cell know where to go? And it's because of these things, like complement, especially complement. Remember we talked about our thugs, macrophages, and T cytotoxic cells, also known as your CD8 plus cells. We'll add NK cells to the list. They are a small population of lymphocytes. They are different from B and T cells. They are killers. And they're really good at viruses and cancers. Because of course they have perforins that perforate or put holes in viral or cancer cell membranes, and it lyses the cell. It breaks down the cell. And of course, just like macrophages and natural killer cells, just like macrophages and T cytotoxic or CD8 plus T cells, they'll enhance inflammation. Phagocytosis, we already know. Neutrophils are really good at phagocytosis. Monocytes that turn into macrophages are really good at it. We already know the definition of chemotaxis. Fever. We mentioned fever briefly in previous lectures. It's when your brain does not like what's going on in your body, so they will have an environment, they will change the thermoregulatory set point, right, in your brain, and through this chemical called interleukin-1, which will then make fever. That's why IL-1 or interleukin-1, which is an immunoglobulin, also is called an endogenous pyrogen. And a nice little side effect that increasing body temperature increases metabolism to increase phagocytic activity. So it gives bacteria a hard time, fungi a hard time, viruses a hard environment when you're above 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Third line of defense, I want you to think specific, adaptive specific defense. So that's one of the things is that they have to know is you can't have friendly fire. So remember the antigens we talked about? The antigens are the jackets. They tell us who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. If you have a bad guy jacket, the thugs that we talked about, the B cells and T cells that we talked about will attack. And of course, T cells are called cellular immune response. B cells are called the humoral immune response. B cells, of course, are memory cells that create antibodies. And we already talked about the T helper cells, CD4 plus, and the T killer or the T cytotoxic cells, CD8 plus cell in that role. Antigens or the jackets can be made out of anything, proteins, polysaccharides, glycoproteins, glycolipids. But again, its function is for identification. Autoimmune diseases attack yourself because it doesn't recognize the jacket, and then you'll have friendly fire all day, every day. B cells and T cells, we already know T cells, they're from the thymus, and B cells, they're from bone marrow. Don't worry about this bursa fabricus of chickens. It'll just confuse you. Think B, bone marrow. T, thymus. Antibodies is a protein. Again, one of the gamma globulins. Again, part of your plasma proteins. And you must know the 5 major types. IgG is the most common, and they act on everybody. Bacteria, viruses, toxins. IgA, also known as secretory IgA, are found in tears and in your sweat glands. So that's why they're called secretory IgA. They're found in exocrine gland secretions. Specifically, saliva, tears are number 1, number 2. IgM, think McDonald's. It's the stuff that's found in food and bacteria. That's how I remember it. IgD, common in infants. And IgE, therefore, allergies. Yes, it says exocrine gland secretions, but I want you to remember allergies. IgE is really common in allergies. Okay. This is what an antibody looks like. It's Y-shaped with a specific antigen binding site, and that therefore the antibody will only specifically attack a specific thing. It's kind of in the same way lock and key that we talked about regarding enzymes. Like lipases only break down lipids. A peptidase will only break down protein. Well, specific antibodies will only break down specific things. Now, you have your primary response, right, which is slow. Typically, IgM goes an IgG, right? And then you have some memory cells. It takes about a week or 2. And then the next time you get sick or the next time you get exposed to the same exact thing, your secondary immune response is much quicker, about a day or 2. And of course, that is your B cells, your memory cells, and your T cells. And remember, the T cells can create memory cells because remember after the story I told you, when the T helper, after it tells the cytotoxic T cell to go to go phagocytose or kill the pathogen, it tells the B cell like, hey, remember this guy again so I don't have to deal with him. Okay? And memory B cells and antibodies, months to years. Okay. Here's some other classifications, natural versus artificial. Of course, natural is a natural process, like you either can get sick or your mom could give it to you via, mother's milk. That's one way to do it. Artificially, of course, is, vaccines. You also have passive versus active. Passive is temporary, right? And you get that through antibodies. No immune response was evoked. That means you never really got sick, right? So, but active immunity is if you really got sick, you made B cells, okay, and you went through the whole process, okay? And last topic is your hypersensitivities. You need to know all 4 of them. And one, I want you to think of what? Allergies. And the most dangerous one of the allergies is anaphylactic shock. Shock is when your cardiovascular system no longer can deliver blood to where it needs to go. That's how bad anaphylaxis or a severe allergy can get. But type 1, you want to think 1 first, immediate action, immediate reaction, and you get anaphylactic shock, you get it within minutes. And deals with IgE, allergies. Okay. Hypersensitivity type 2, I want you to think transfusion reactions. Several of you asked me questions about graft versus host disease. Well, transfusions and that kind of thing is under type 2 or antibody dependent cytotoxic reactions. Type 3, I want you to think of arthritis, right? Damaged tissue that no longer looks like your original tissue, and now your body sees that damaged tissue as a threat, and then you have inflammation, and that's what typically happens in your arthritides, specifically rheumatoid arthritis. And last but not least, since it's the last one, it's delayed. Usually it's some sort of dermatologic thing. And remember the story I told you in lecture. I gave a friend of mine a crappy, cheap street bracelet from a vendor. And what happened in a day, it happened like a little bit after a day. Her skin turned a different color and then she got really itchy. And that was delayed reaction hypersensitivity. Okay, that's the last slide. Oh, is it the last slide? Oh, transplant tissue rejection. I thought that was the last slide. It used to be the last slide, but I guess we have some other stuff. Those of you I talked about regarding graft versus host disease, it's damage. Remember, when your body doesn't recognize the thing that's inside you as you, it will attack it. And that's why the donor and recipient has to have the best match possible. And that match system is called your MHC system, right? Which is major histocompatibility antigens. Histo, your tissues, compatibility, are they compatible, right? And that's why we give you massive amounts of corticosteroids. So we immunosuppress you so you don't attack your new kidney or your new heart, or whoever gave you that. Oops. Know these definitions: autograft, isograph, allograft, xenograft. Nice to know, right? This is better to know, but this is nice to know. Autoimmunity, we already talked about that. It is when your immune system cannot recognize itself, and then there becomes friendly fire, meaning that your macrophages and your T cytotoxic cells and your NK cells will start attacking your body. And that's not good because you're going to have multi-systemic effects. Okay, and we have a whole bunch of theories, most of them genetic, but it's usually the failure of your body to chemically recognize itself. Okay, on that note, um, we're done, and study, study, study. I'll see you in class.